Welcome. I'm Ann Kapuscinski. I'm a professor in the Environmental Studies program and do a lot of work in the sustainability science area, so I'm particularly honored to be introducing our distinguished speaker this evening for Food Day. Before I introduce him, though, I want to thank some people and make a few announcements around Food Day. Dartmouth has been hosting Food Day, which has become a kind of national phenomenon on university campuses around the country. I was asking Casey Wright about this earlier. This is what, maybe the 6th time that there's been a series of Food Day events that go on really for throughout parts of October, but especially in the week around the state. So I'd like by starting to thank our sponsors for the keynotes talk tonight and really the range of the Food Day events. It includes Dartmouth Dining Services. We're honored to have both director and associate director and the culinary services director of DDS here with us. Also the Environmental Studies program and also the Porter Fund for Sustainability in the Curriculum. But the reason we actually get to have keynote speakers and have all these things organized for Food Day is because we have this behind the scenes but super active trio of amazing women who have pulled together every year a sort of ad hoc committee that's really become now a tradition, really almost a ritual for coming together to organize Food Day. And these women include Kim Wind, who's the program administrator for environmental studies, standing back there. But also Casey Wright, who is the Dick's House nutritionist. Casey, sitting right here. And Beth Rosenberger, who's the dietitian for DDS. And Beth, in particular, has been coordinating the Food Day event since 2012. So to get to the point that we have this wonderful keynote speaker event tonight, planning starts months ahead of time, and we couldn't do it without them, and also all the people involved in the Food Day committee, which is basically an ad hoc gathering of who wants to be at the table to help out to do this. So it's faculty, students, and staff. A little bit more about Food Day. I want to alert you to 2 other events this week that may interest you. One is Thursday, this Thursday, October 19th, there'll be a harvest dinner at 1953 Commons from 5 to 8:30. You'll get a chance to taste the best of local and regional foods, and there's a lot of local farmers who come and food artisans join the celebration, so hope you can come to that. And then Saturday, we will have Harfest at the Dartmouth Organic Farm, 1 to 4 p.m. For the first-year students, if you haven't already been to the Dartmouth Organic Farm, or even for other people, if you haven't been to the Dartmouth Organic Farm, it's an absolutely beautiful place, especially gorgeous with the fall colors, and so I really encourage you to come. There'll be, again, a chance to enjoy seasonal food, live music, painting pumpkins, and more. Okay, it's now really my great honor to introduce our speaker, Malik Yakini. Malik has, well, he's involved in a lot of stuff. This guy is not only a visionary, but he's a shaker and a mover. He's the kind of visionary who doesn't just come up with great ideas. He rolls up his sleeves and just gets to work on making them happen, especially in terms of helping his own community to really self-determine its future and its present. So Malik is the co-founder and the executive director of the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. This organization, as you'll get to hear as he talks this evening, operates a 7-acre urban farm. If any of you have any sense of what urban farming involves, to have a 7-acre urban farm in Detroit is really quite an accomplishment. And he's spearheading the opening of an even bigger endeavor, a really major co-op grocery store in Detroit's North End, and he'll be talking to you some more about that, I'm sure. He's also a board member of Food First, also known as the Institute for Food and Development Policy. Food First is a very well-known organization in the space of looking at issues around the intersection of food systems, justice, and equity. And he's the former chair of the Detroit Food Policy Council. I think, though, I want to end by expressing to you that one of the things that's really unique and inspiring about Malik's work has to do with how we think about food. Many of you have probably heard the expression that eating is an ecological act. In Malik's work, he engages with that, but he also engages with the fact that eating is a political act, it's a cultural act, it's a social act, it's an identity act, it's an act about meaning in all its dimensions. And he thinks not only about the eating, but about how the food is grown, where it comes from, who has a say in where to grow the food, how to make sure that the food that's grown is actually contributing to food sovereignty and food access. And really, ultimately, not only who has a seat at the table, but who gets to kind of determine what the table is and what the agenda is going to be. So that's what makes his work so inspiring. It's very hard work. And for especially our students out there, including my students who are taking my Environmental Studies 3 class right now, we're having a lively debate about, how to get inspired to actually take up the hard work. I think Malik is a really fantastic example and inspiration. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Malik, let him come up to the speak. After he speaks, we'll do question and answer with roving mics, and I'll help to moderate that. So thank you, and welcome, Malik.
Good evening. How's everyone doing? It's a pleasure to be here. I've had a wonderful time since I've been here for the last about 25 hours. And I've met some absolutely wonderful people. And the great thing about being able to travel around the country and talk and share about our work is I also get a chance to learn. So I got a chance to learn quite a few things today. And so I really value that kind of exchange. So whenever I have the opportunity to speak publicly, I always start by giving praise and acknowledgement to the Creator. And I'm certainly not trying to impose my spiritual views on anyone, but that's a platform that I stand on, so I always put that first in front of me. And then secondly, I always give honor to my ancestors, both those in my personal bloodline and also the ancestors that African American people share collectively, upon whose backs the wealth of the Western world was built. I'd also like to thank the people who invited me, and I always feel grateful when people invite me to speak, because I have to tell you, I don't operate by anybody's script. And so frankly, people don't know what I'm going to say, and so it takes courageous people to invite me to speak. Sometimes I don't know what I'm going to say, frankly. And so I want to thank Kim first, who was wonderful. Where is Kim? Thank you. I want to thank Kim, who's been wonderful in working all the logistics out and emailing back and forth with me over the last several months trying to get everything straight. I want to thank Ann. I want to thank Beth, Casey, and all of the others. And see, when I start naming names, the problem is I always forget somebody's name who contributed to this. So I just want to say collectively thank you to everybody at Dartmouth who helped to make this event happen. I also want to thank Alexandra. Is she here? Where is she? Throw your hands up. Throw your hands up. I mean, hi, not just like that. No. But in fact, stand up, please. Stand up. And the reason I want to thank her is because I understand that she's the person that suggested me to come. So I just want to let you know that I'm grateful for that suggestion. I want to thank some folks that I've met since I've been here. Michaela, I don't know if she's here or not. I don't think I've seen Michaela. But Michaela spent some time in Detroit doing some work. And we had a chance to have dinner together last night along with Kaylin and who else? And Alex, yes. Also, I want to thank Nick and Laura. I want to thank the folks from the Hanover Food Co-op who I met with this afternoon. And forgive me, I forgot your name. Hannah, yes. And several other folks who I met with this afternoon who were very gracious and shared quite a bit of information about the co-op that they've developed here that's been operating since 1936, and shared a great deal of vital information that's going to help us as we're developing a co-op in the city of Detroit. I also always like to acknowledge the people who are kind of behind the scenes. So we kind of just assume, we walk into an auditorium and it's set up and there's cameras going and there's lights on and it's clean. And we often don't think about the people behind the scenes that do the work that make these things happen. So I want to start by thanking Diane, who is the tech person who helped get all this the PowerPoint and all that in place, and all of the other workers who, when we leave out of here, will come in the room and clean up, and we often don't think about them. They're invisibilized. So I just want to thank them, the cameraman, and everybody else who's playing a role in making this happen who don't normally get acknowledged. So I want to bring greetings from the organization that I represent, which is the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. And I think it's important to know that I'm a member of an organization. And I'm of the belief that any significant change that happens in the world happens because a collective group of people with similar values come together and work collectively to make that happen. So I happen to be a spokesperson for the group. But while I'm here in Hanover today speaking to you, there's people who are working on our farm who don't get a chance to go around the country and speak. And so I want to let you know that I'm part of an organization. I just happen to be the spokesperson. And I want to acknowledge my comrades both in the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and also those comrades in the city of Detroit who might not be in the organization I'm in, but who are also doing really significant work both in urban agriculture to create a vibrant local food system and doing work to create, to reimagine what a place like Detroit that so many people have given up on can become. So, how many people like stories? Great. So I want to tell you a story, and I love doing this in highfalutin university settings. And so this is a story you might have heard of, and I call this a classic story retold. And the name of this story, and again, you may have heard of it, is called The Little Red Hen. You all heard that story before? Only 2 people have heard it? But so this story involves audience participation. Part of the African-American cultural experience is what we call call and response. And I know at a lot of universities, people like to just sit in their chairs and listen to the person speak. But I'm going to compel you to participate in this. And so the part you're going to see, and I want you to repeat this after me now, just to practice, the part you're going to say is this: and she did. Let's practice that. And she did. Great. Okay, here we go. Once upon a time, in a village in Africa, a hen scratched about the yard until she uncovered some grains of wheat. She called to her neighbors and said, "If we plant this wheat, we can have bread to eat. Who will help me plant it?" "Not I," said the cow. "I thought slavery was over." Let me explain this. Let me explain this. So I work in a primarily African-American community. And what we found is that in agricultural work, that typically the frame of reference that many black people have for agricultural work has to do with enslavement or sharecropping. Black people here. You look like you might be from Kenya. You from Kenya? Yes. No? Say it again? Burundi. Oh, Burundi, okay. So, but for those African descendant people born here in the Western Hemisphere, many times when we talk about agriculture, the frame of reference we have is enslavement or sharecropping. So when a lot of youth come out to our farm, within the first 15 minutes, we hear some reference to slavery. So it's bad when you have to explain a joke, but. "Not I," said the goat. "It probably won't grow anyway." "Not I," said the duck. "I'm much too busy." "Not I," said the lamb. "I don't do dirt." "Then I will," said the little red hen. And she did. After a few months, the wheat grew tall and ripened into golden grains reaching up to the sun. Beneficial insects and beautiful birds began to return to the village. The little red hen again called to her neighbors. "Who will help me harvest the wheat?" "Not I," said the cow. "My stomach's ache." "Not I," said the goat. "I don't really get involved in groups." "Not I," said the duck. "I've got a wheat allergy." "Not I," said the lamb. "My favorite rapper, Young Shepherd, is performing in a free concert this afternoon." "Then I will harvest it myself," said the little red hen. And she did. The hen carried the wheat back to her house and asked her neighbors, "Who will help me grind the wheat into flour?" "Not I," said the cow. "I already have 2 jobs." "Not I," said the goat. "I don't have anyone to watch my kids." This is admittedly corny, okay? Not I, said the duck, I'm trying to get paid. Not I, said the lamb, you running game, hen, you probably trying to pull the wool over my eyes. Then I will grind it myself, said the little red hen. And she did. I see the farmer likes this joke. After resting from the exhausting work of grinding the grain, the little red hen made one last attempt to solicit the help of her neighbors. Who will help me make this flour into dough and bake the bread? She was met with the usual litany of excuses. Not I, said the cow. Chewing cud takes all the energy I've got. Not I, said the goat. My kids have music lessons. Not I, said the duck. My cousin Donald and his family are visiting from out of town. Not I, said the lamb. I'm studying for my real estate license. Then I will bake the bread myself, said the little red hen. And she did. As the aroma of the freshly baked bread drifted out into the village, the little red hen's neighbors began to gather outside of her door. Who will help me eat this bread? Asked the little red hen. I will, said the cow. I will, said the goat. I will, said the duck. I will, said the lamb. No, you won't, said the little red hen. None of you practiced ujima, collective work and responsibility. However, my beloved neighbors, I didn't grind all of the grain. I started a seed bank to have wheat for the next year. Here's a handful of grain for each of you. And she sent them packing. As the little red hen sat down to enjoy her still warm bread with honey from the beehives that her friend maintained at the Dartmouth Farm, the cow, the goat, the duck, and the lamb called a meeting to form an organic, sustainable farming collective. The next season, they all worked together to plant, harvest, and grind their wheat and bake bread. There was plenty for all. They donated some to the animals who were homeless or sick and sold the surplus at farmers markets in neighboring villages. And rumor is they even sold some at the Hanover Co-op. The village continued to prosper and eventually started manufacturing farming and baking equipment. The little red hen was elected chief of the village council. So I like to start with something light before I launch into white supremacy, right? So to kind of get everybody relaxed, and then we get to the heavier stuff. So we'll get to that in a minute, though. So I want to tell you a bit about the context of Detroit, where I do the work that I do, along with the people that I work with. Detroit is often in the news, a lot of times for really, really bad stuff. You probably heard about the bankruptcy, the largest municipal bankruptcy in the United States. And there's stories about acres and acres of barren land in Detroit. I was in Toronto a couple of years ago at a friend's house, and the Toronto Star had a story on the front page about packs of wild dogs roaming the city of Detroit. I've never seen that myself, but so these are the kind of narratives that much of the world hears about the city of Detroit. And to tell you the truth, there's a crisis in the city of Detroit, but often what we hear is only part of the picture. So I want to share with you some of the realities, some of the bleak realities that we're faced with. So Detroit currently has a population of about 667,000 people. In 1950, when the population was at its height, Detroit had 1.9 million people. And as I was sharing with some folks earlier today, that gave the city government the task of maintaining a city that was geographically the same size. The footprint didn't shrink, but with only a third of the population. And so, of course, residents of the city pay taxes, and also many of the businesses left, and those businesses paid taxes. So by the time Detroit's first African-American mayor, Coleman Young, was elected in 1973, the city had a tax base which was considerably smaller than it had been 20 years prior to that. Detroit is approximately 139 square miles. About 1/3 of the city is vacant land. And so I always have to correct myself because a friend of mine reminds me that although the land is not being used by human beings, it's being re-inhabited by pheasants and rabbits and other animals, so in a sense it's not vacant, but about 1/3 of the land in the city is not being utilized by human beings. About 39% of the population of Detroit lives below the federal poverty line. In fact, Detroit is, I heard last week, has the highest poverty rate in the country for a city of its size. About 40% of the population in Detroit doesn't own an automobile, which is significant because, of course, Detroit is known as the Motor City, and Detroit has no robust public transportation system like New York City, Chicago, Toronto, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Oakland, California. No kind of subway you can get on. The only thing Detroit has is buses, which are often late, dirty, and dangerous. And so for people who don't own an automobile, the simple act of going grocery shopping can be a challenge. Trying to carry bags of groceries back on a bus that may or may not come on time, and you may be blocks from the bus line as well. So I'm told, and I can't verify this as a fact, but I'm told that several decades ago, the auto manufacturers, Standard Oil, and some of the tire manufacturers conspired to undermine public transportation in the city of Detroit as a way of coercing people to buy automobiles. And so that has, again, a profound impact for the 40% of Detroiters who don't own an automobile. When I was growing up in Detroit, there were at least 7 national chain grocery stores in the city, all of which had multiple locations, so no matter where you lived in the city, you were within walking distance of a full-service grocery store. As of 2007, the last of those stores closed, which was called Farmer Jack, and there were no national chain supermarkets in Detroit as of 2007. In 2013, the first national chain since that time opened in the city of Detroit, which is Whole Foods. Did someone say Jesus? So, and you know, so a lot of my friends, a lot of my activist friends like to really bash Whole Foods, and I'm not really a Whole Foods basher. But I do have to say that I can't really shop there. I go in and buy 1 or 2 items, but I can't afford to buy the bulk of my groceries there, and most Detroiters can't afford to do that either. So we have a real crisis in the city of Detroit because many Detroiters are forced to buy foodish items from what we call party stores in the city of Detroit. And a party store is similar to what in New York they call a bodega, a store that might sell cigarettes, soda pop, potato chips, lottery tickets, and food-like substances that are in styrofoam containers, cans, boxes, and usually have lots and lots of salt and artificial colorings and preservatives and things that certainly do not promote optimal health. We also have a problem because about 83% of Detroit's 667,000 people are African Americans, and there's not one African American grocery store in the city of Detroit. In fact, there's not one African American grocery store in the state of Michigan. In fact, there's not one African American owned grocery store in the Midwest United States, and there's probably less than 10 in the entire country. And so we have a tremendous problem in the city of Detroit because we have another ethnic group, and I want to preface this remark because I don't want people to mistake what I'm saying. And I want to preface the remark by saying that the ethnic groups that own stores in African communities aren't the problem. The problem is the capitalist system that pits groups against each other. But in the case of Detroit, there's an ethnic group called Chaldeans, an ethnic minority, a Christian minority from Iraq, who has a long history of entrepreneurship, who moved into Detroit and kind of filled the void. Many of them are attempting to be good corporate citizens and good members of the community. Far too many are not. And so what we find is that we have a power imbalance in the city of Detroit, similar to the power imbalance that exists if you have someone like Roger Ailes, who's in a very powerful position, and a beautiful young woman comes to him to get a job, and then he abuses that power in order to gain personal favor. So typically, when you have a power imbalance, it creates an environment which is ripe for abuse. And so we have that kind of power imbalance in the city of Detroit, where we see far too often in the stores that the majority of our community has to go to purchase these food-like items, several things occur. On the most basic level, we have what I call wordless transactions. So in the smaller stores in particular, there's always bulletproof glass between the clerk and the customer. And often what happens is that you pick out your item, you put it in the turnstile, they turn it around, bag it up, ring it up on the register, you see the cost, you put your money through the slot, they turn it around, you get your bag, and you leave. What's wrong with that transaction?
No personal interaction.
No personal interaction, no acknowledgement even of your humanity. No thank you for your business, come again, we appreciate you. It's almost as if far too many of the merchants expect that the community members are obligated to support their stores. And so that's a tremendous problem in the city of Detroit. And over the last 20 years, we've had several incidences of women being sexually harassed. In fact, the sexual harassment happens almost daily, frankly, where a woman's going to buy a loaf of bread and she's propositioned, right? If you're going to buy a loaf of bread, you're not looking for a date, presumably. But again, because of this imbalance in power, we see this happening far too often. In some cases, there was an incident I was involved in responding to about 2 years ago. A woman I know was actually sexually assaulted, and she happened to be 4 months pregnant, too. A group of us mobilized to close down the store, and the person who was accused of the sexual assault was quickly disappeared. Let's put it like, we don't know where he went, and he, of course, was never prosecuted. That was compounded by the fact that there have been something like 10,000 rape kits in the city of Detroit that haven't been processed because of the city's lack of finances to be able to process these kits. And so, so we have a really terrible situation in that regard in the city of Detroit. So you probably hear a lot about the comeback of the city. That's in the news often. It's sometimes referred to as the comeback, sometimes it's referred to as the Renaissance of Detroit. And I want to speak on that just briefly and say that it is true that in some parts of the city, we're seeing a kind of renaissance or regeneration. But the parts of the city where this is happening are the areas that are called downtown, an area that has been renamed Midtown, and a couple of other areas in the city. The vast majority of the city, where the majority of the population lives, in the neighborhoods, is seeing no impact from this recovery, comeback, or renaissance. So, not coincidentally, the areas that are experiencing this renaissance are also the areas where many young whites have recently moved into the city. And so these are the areas that are where a tremendous amount of capital is being poured in. We see new restaurants opening up. We see all kinds of new businesses. We see bike paths. We see dog parks. We see, of course, Starbucks and Whole Foods. And so we see very uneven development in the city of Detroit, and many of us refer to it as a tale of two cities. Two Detroits are developing. And so rather than creating greater equity in the city of Detroit, what we're seeing is greater disparity. The idea seems to be on the part of the elected and appointed officials that if you invest money in areas of the city where you have more well-to-do people, then somehow that wealth trickles down to the rest of us. And as I said at dinner with some of the faculty, I've seen no historical evidence that that's true, and I don't expect it to happen in this case either. We also have a real challenge with land distribution. I think I said, no, maybe I didn't say, about 1/3 of the city is vacant land. About 1/3 of that 139, I did say that, yes. 1/3 of that 139 square miles is unused by human beings. And so as you can imagine, in a city that is rapidly gentrifying with huge amounts and sometimes vast swaths of open land, sometimes blocks, contiguous blocks with no houses at all, that there's land grabbing going on in the city of Detroit. And so one of those land grabs was by a man named John Hance. And a few years ago, there was a lot of publicity in the national news about John Hance, who said he wanted to start the world's largest urban farm in the city of Detroit. And we had a tremendous community struggle because many of us thought that was a very dangerous idea. I want to read to you just a little bit from a chapter I have in this book. This book is called Land Justice, Reimagining Land, Food, and the Commons in the United States. This is published by Food First. And in all honesty, so I'm credited as an author. Actually, what they did is they interviewed me because I really didn't have time to write the chapter. So they interviewed me and crafted it into this beautiful chapter. So this is from a section in the chapter, and it's called Land Speculation and Acquisition. One of the most critical issues that Detroit's food justice community has faced in recent years is the large-scale sale of land to a man named John Hance. Hance is an area businessman who says that as he drove every day through the city and looked out at its landscape, the idea came to him that what the city lacked was scarcity that encourages entrepreneurs to buy. He professes to believe that if we could take the first step in acquiring a large piece of land, he would prompt others to do the same. When he first approached the city about purchasing land, he said he wanted to create the world's largest urban farm. Specifically, he proposed constructing a massive 5,000-acre urban farm and urban agricultural research facility. City residents reacted strongly. They worried, among other things, that because the city had not yet created ordinances to govern urban agriculture, an operation of this scale would put city residents in direct contact with pesticides and other farm chemicals. In response, Hance scaled back his project and planned to build a 140-acre woodlands, a tree farm project. He said it will help to beautify Detroit. In 2012, the city council agreed to sell him over 1,500 parcels. The largest threat posed to the land and food justice movements by the Hance sale is not the nature of the tree farm itself, although his claims that it will beautify the city's landscape have thus far not been proven. The concern is that the sale sets a very dangerous precedent. So I want to just share with you that, again, many of us in the urban agricultural movement actively oppose the sale of this land. We think that land needs to be put in the hands of the residents, and we favor things like community land trusts that offer the opportunity for residents to have say-so over the vacant land in their own communities, rather than seeing land as a commodity that goes to the highest bidder. And so we actually did door-to-door organizing in the neighborhood that Hance eventually bought this land, and we pressured the Detroit City Council to have a public listening session where we got more than 400 residents to come out, the vast majority of whom were opposed to the sale. Unfortunately, the very next day, the City Council voted to sell him the land. So this is one example of the type of development that we see in Detroit that's being touted as Detroit's comeback. There's also another very wealthy man named Dan Gilbert, who's the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, who owns more than 80 buildings in downtown Detroit. He has his own private police force that patrols downtown. He has cameras on buildings throughout the downtown area, including he's been criticized for putting cameras on buildings that he doesn't own and didn't get permission from the owner. So again, we have kind of this separate, very elite enclave that's developed in downtown Detroit while the rest of the city is left to languish. I want to share with you, there's many positive things also happening, and I'm going to go to the PowerPoint presentation, but there's many very positive things happening in Detroit as well. So anytime you have oppressive conditions and you have conditions that suppress people's full human potential, human beings respond to that. And so there's lots of very positive responses happening in the city of Detroit, and one of the most positive of those responses is the urban agricultural movement, which is looking at how we use this vacant land in the city of Detroit, both to provide greater access to fresh, healthy produce, to serve as an economic engine for the city of Detroit, to create more green spaces, to create kind of the intergenerational dialogue that occurs in gardens and weaves back the social fabric, which is so necessary to have a healthy community. And there's more than 1,500, in fact, more than 1,600 now. I just got some updated information 2 days ago from the person who runs a program called the Garden Resource Program. There's currently more than 1,600 gardens, such as backyard gardens, side lot gardens, school gardens, and community gardens, and small farms in the city of Detroit. Of those 1,600, the organization that I'm executive director of, the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, runs the largest of those 1,600 agricultural operations. Largest doesn't mean better. In fact, really what it means is that we've got more work to do. We got more work to do. So if we can get the PowerPoint up, I want to tell you a bit about the story of DTown Farm. So our organization was founded in 2006, and it was and is our belief that the most effective movements grow organically out of the communities that they're designed to serve. We're not looking for saviors. I was sharing this with some of the faculty at dinner. We're not looking for saviors. And unfortunately, one of the characteristics of white supremacy is to suggest to white people that their knowledge of the world, number one, is sufficient, that they don't need to have an understanding of the culture and historical knowledge of other peoples. And you can go all the way through school and get a PhD and know almost nothing about the cultures of people of color, right? And so not only does that suppress African people and other people of color, but it also deprives people who are considered to be white of the rich cultural knowledge of other peoples on the face of the earth. And so everybody suffers as a result of that. So one of the characteristics of this system of white supremacy is it suggests to people who are white that because they think their knowledge is sufficient, and many times think the knowledge is superior to that of other people, that they can be the saviors of folks. And so we have lots of saviors who come into Detroit and think that they're going to save us. And we push back against that, and we affirm that the most effective movements are the movements that grow out of the people themselves in their effort to reimagine what their own future will become. One of our early goals was to develop a 2-acre farm in the city of Detroit. So when we first started in 2006, we were influenced by some discussions that were taking place in the Community Food Security Coalition, an organization that no longer exists, but is one of the organizations that was a convener of many of the people doing urban ag throughout the United States. And at that time, the kind of prevailing wisdom in the food movement, at least in the circles I was running in, was that the difference between a garden and a farm was scale, and that if you had at least 2 acres, you could legitimately say you were a farm. So in retrospect, our thinking was a bit skewed, but at the time, that's where we were. So we wanted to have at least 2 acres so we could say, we really got a farm. We started in 2006 with a 1/4 acre, and it was on the city's east side on a block where all the houses had been torn down. And what they used to do in Detroit is knock houses down and just dump all the debris into the basement and cover it up. And so we started trying to till on this land. We thought we were going to till and plant, and we started running into old refrigerated parts and cinder blocks and all kind of stuff. So we quickly realized that wasn't going to happen. So what we did is we use what's called the lasagna method. We built these beds by first putting down cardboard or newspaper, then putting compost and topsoil and kind of layering it like you might do a lasagna, and then planting. They're essentially raised beds without the wood border around it. And this is the first year we started. This was our first farm manager, by the way, Neferah Barber. And you can see we have several of these. You can't really see the full scope of it, but we had this whole 1/4 acre planted, which we did pretty quickly, turned into this very vibrant, lush garden, and people were absolutely amazed at what we had done. In 2007, we had to move from that location because the developer bought it. In fact, the first year we were what some people call guerrilla gardeners. We had about as much authorization to be on that land as the Europeans who came over here to the Western Hemisphere. So a developer bought the land in 2007. We had to move. In 2007, we were on another location owned by a church. We farmed there in 2007. That's not what this picture is. I've gotten ahead of myself with the slides. But we were on this spot owned by a church. We farmed there in 2007. Unfortunately, in March of 2008, I got a call from one of the bishops in the church saying they had other plans for the land. As fate would have it, we had been negotiating with the Detroit City Council for 2 years. In fact, myself and our board president in 2006 spoke before the Detroit City Council, and we were critical of the city for not having a comprehensive food policy, and we were appointed on the spot to, in fact, develop a policy, which we did. That's another story. We did develop that policy, and it's still the official food security policy for the city of Detroit. That policy called for the formation of the Detroit Food Policy Council, which we also led the formation of, and I served as its chair for the first 2 years. And a couple other things. We asked the city for some tractors because we knew the city had owned some tractors during the 70s when, under Mayor Coleman Young, when they had a program called the Farm-A-Lot program. So we were like, well, where are the tractors? What happened to the tractors? We want access to them. To this day, we haven't got an answer to that. But the last thing we asked for is we asked the city to give us 2 acres of city-owned land. Now, in reality, we didn't really expect the city just to give us 2 acres. But when you're negotiating, you always set the bar high and let whoever you're negotiating with kind of work you down. And so after 2 years of discussions and kind of being bounced around from department to department, because the reality is the city didn't know how to process our request. The city's used to somebody coming and saying, I want to build a parking structure. They know how to process that. Or I want to build housing. They know how to process that. But somebody saying we want land to build a model organic farm, they didn't know what hook to hang this on. So we were bounced from department to department. As fate would have it, in May of 2006, we were still farmers without a place to farm. And we got a call from the city. They said, come out here to Rouge Park, the largest park in the city. There's a section of the park called the Myers Tree Nursery. We want you to look around there and see if there's a spot you liked. So this is actually the first day that we went out to look at what eventually became DTown Farm. And we saw a spot that we liked because it was there was a kind of an opening where we didn't have to go with chainsaws and cut down big trees, and also there was a fire hydrant nearby, and so we assumed that a fire hydrant meant we could access water. That's another story. Maybe I'll tell you another time. Bottom line, in June of 2008, we started clearing the land, and this became DTown Farm. These are some of the summer interns that we had that first year. And we heard the same thing from them. Oh, you're working me like a slave. I thought slavery was over. But after they kind of put some carrots and beets in the ground and saw those things grow up, they were like, I planted that one. That's mine. I planted that carrot. So they had this real sense of ownership. In 2011, we annexed an additional 5 acres, giving us a total of 7 acres, making this the largest farm in the city of Detroit. So this is a friend of mine named Lauren, and I really like this picture because we rely heavily on volunteers at our farm. And there's some people I've been working on for 4 or 5 years trying to get them to come out and volunteer, and they have all kind of excuses. And I just love this picture because this picture just like takes all the excuses away. So we grow more than 30 different fruits, vegetables, and herbs. This is Jackie Hunt, who was one of our original members. She was the assistant farm manager. She's standing in a field of collard greens that we grew that year. And I don't know if this is true, but rumor has it that DTown Farm has the sweetest collard greens in the city of Detroit. I can't verify it, but I'm kind of willing to believe that. Watermelons, cabbage, spinach, we grow all kinds of stuff. Almost anything that you can find in a grocery store in the produce section that grows in the climate that we're in, we grow. We also raise bees for pollination of the crops and for honey production. I am not a beekeeper. Let me say that clearly. I respect beekeepers, and I especially respect beekeepers who handle the hives with no gloves. But I'm not the one, personally, okay? We have a large-scale composting operation. So this is actually two different pictures. So this first slide is how we started composting. Will Allen with Growing Power is one of our mentors, and he's created a system using pallets to make bins. And so we started with that system, and this bin was probably the most photographed compost bin in the city of Detroit for several years. And then we moved to a larger scale compost operation. And so actually this other picture is the first day that we started our large scale composting operation. And so we currently have one of the largest composting operations in the city of Detroit. We have an agreement with a nonprofit called Forgotten Harvest that is a food rescue operation that gets food from grocery stores that can no longer be sold. Some of it can still be consumed and goes to food banks. The rest of it ends up with us. So we get tremendous amounts. We get tons at a time of food that is spoiled, and we use that as our nitrogen source, and we have another agreement with the county forestry department where we get wood chips, and we use that as our carbon source. So we make what's called windrows. They might be 50 feet long and 6 or 8 feet tall, and then we turn them periodically with our tractor, keep it hydrated. After about 7 months, we have finished compost, which is the main input that we use to keep our soil fertile. This is last year. This is a picture of as we were building one of those windrows, and you can see the magnitude. All of those boxes, that was one delivery, just to show you the magnitude or the scale that we're operating on. So you can see we had corn in several of the boxes, and we had some collard greens in other boxes, but we make these huge piles. And that in itself is an operation. Just the composting is a very labor-intensive operation. We also have 3 hoop houses that we use for season extension. And this one here, this is when we first built it. We actually built it in one place, put the beds in place. This particular hoop house is called the Rolling Thunder. And so, you familiar with those, Laura? Okay. So these are actually rails right here. And this thing is on wheels. And theoretically, you can plant, roll it to position 2, and plant again. So what we did is we built it in one place, and we built the beds, and we rolled it on top of the beds. And it's been there for the last 5 years. We haven't moved it again. So when I was a child, sometimes my mother would say to me, "Your eyes are bigger than your stomach," when I piled my plate up. And so this was the case. Our farm manager at the time saw this at a workshop. She went to a workshop, Elliot Coleman did, and she came back, "Oh, we got to get the Rolling Thunder hoop house. We got to get it." But the reality is we haven't developed the capacity to really use it for what it was meant for. Although we get a tremendous amount of production just out of it being in one location, but we haven't gotten to the point where we can move it to location 2. This is another hoop house. We call this one the USDA hoop house because we got this from a grant from the USDA through the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this was in November, and without a hoop house, you clearly couldn't be growing salad greens in Detroit in November. By the way, look at that soil there. So that's what that's our compost, so you can see how rich that looks. This is another view of the USDA hoop house that I just showed you. This was last summer, actually. So during the colder months, we grow cold weather crops in them and extend the growing season on the front end and the back end. And then during the summer, we plant crops that like lots and lots of heat, like beans and peppers, which is what you see in this picture. And you might notice also in the previous picture, the beds are going across like that. And we reoriented the beds, not only in our hoop houses, but throughout the farm to go the long way so that we can install drip irrigation tape, because it's much easier to run it the long way rather than running it kind of back and forth like that. We also do a lot of agritourism, giving people tours of our farm. We have signs throughout the farm that explain various aspects of our operation, explain various aspects of our worldview. Many young people and older people are introduced to farming at DTown Farm. And so for this person, this was a breakthrough, even just being, we're so disconnected from nature. So just holding an earthworm for this person was a breakthrough. But as you can see, it was only a partial breakthrough because they had on gloves. This is last year, some children working in a collard green patch, and you can just see the joy on their faces. And so really, this is what is even more so than growing the food. Growing the food is important, but growing our own souls and building this kind of sense of connectedness is equally as important as the food that we grow. We do a major harvest festival each September, the weekend closest to the equinox, and we have all kinds of activities for both children and adults. This is a hayride that we had, and that's a tractor that was donated to us last year, by the way, a Mahindra tractor. Mahindra is a company based in India but started in the United States. It's the largest seller of tractors in the world by volume, and they moved back to Detroit a couple of years ago, the Detroit area, to start a technological innovation center, and in conjunction with that, they started an urban agriculture grant program. And so they visited all the farms in the city, and they were most impressed by what we're doing. So we got this grand prize, which is this $30,000 tractor, which makes a lot of jobs at the farm easier. But we also are careful about balancing our use of petroleum burning equipment with manual labor. And we have a kind of ongoing tension at the farm. But I'm for the use of appropriate level technology. So I can tell you that trying to turn a 50-foot compost pile by hand with pitchforks does violence to your body. Yeah. And having a tractor makes life much easier. And so, there's no perfect solution. Yes, it's emitting carbon into the atmosphere. It's saving people's backs. So you kind of have to weigh, and we're constantly kind of having to weigh decisions, competing factors as we make decisions at DTown Farm. This is we also have live music. We have a stage at the farm, and this is a DJ out of Kansas City. His name is DJ Cavem, C-A-V-E-M. Anybody hip hop fan in the audience? Throw your hands up if you love hip hop. Only 2 people love hip hop. She was like, oh, well, yeah, I kind of like it. So if you love hip hop, don't sleep on DJ Cavem. Google him. He's on YouTube. He's dope. He's dope, I'm telling you. So he's like an eco-justice hip hop artist. You might want to bring him here, too. You might want to bring him here. In fact, I would highly recommend it. So, and he's a practitioner. So not only does he make dope beats and rap on top of them, but he actually is a farmer and a gardener and an eco-justice activist himself. So he performed at our Harvest Festival. This is a good friend of mine, Shane Bernardo, who is conducting a workshop on creating a just and equitable food system. So all of that is folded into the fabric of what we do at the Harvest Festival. These are some of the young people. We had a bee workshop, and all the youth who came out to the bee workshop, they got the little antennas and what have you. And again, you can just see the joy. And so for us, this is what it's all about, kind of affirming joy. And I have to say this, that even in the face of the things that we're facing with your current U.S. president, he ain't my president, okay? But for those of you who claim him, even in the face of that and the kind of regressive policies that we're seeing, it's important that we don't let people steal our joy. It's important that we don't let people steal our joy. And so even in the face of all odds, we're still going to find that inner strength and find that joy, and we're going to manifest it, and that's what keeps us going. So it's important. It's easy to become demoralized in the face of, the kind of crisis that humanity and the planet is faced with. But even in the face of this crisis, we have to be optimistic, we have to be joyful, and so for me, this picture represents that. Some of the things that have happened in the last couple of years at DTown Farm is this is our tool shed, and we have all these dope African Adinkra symbols. I was talking to somebody about Adinkra symbols earlier. And then we have this solar panel on top of the shed, and that solar panel is powering inside the shed a charging station where we can charge walkie-talkies and cell phones. And so that's been very useful. Also, you see another small solar panel there, which is powering that light. And we have some solar-powered lights throughout the farm as well. So before I started doing food work full-time, I was principal of an African-centered school that I helped to co-found. And this young man is a graduate of the school. He went on to get 2 degrees in mechanical engineering. He designed this solar energy station that we have. About 5 years ago, somebody donated 10 solar panels to us. And they sat at our farm for several years while we had a committee that was researching how to go about putting this into place and, you know, going to trainings and having more meetings and meetings and more meetings. And so finally he stepped in and he just took the bull by the horns and he made it happen. And so he convinced the local utility company to build these frames that the solar panels are mounted on. They put vents in the side of the container. On the other side, there's a roll-up door so we can move our heavy equipment in there and secure it. We are in Detroit. People do steal things in Detroit. We've had some major theft. And so now that's the only electricity we have on the farm. We're off the grid totally. And so this is our only source of electricity. I'm so proud of him. His name is Ali, because he's actually doing what we often talk about, young people going to school, getting skills and knowledge, and coming back to help their community. This is his first solar project. He's since done many other projects throughout the city. This is another view of the completed solar energy station. Also, I mentioned to you about the new tractor. We got a road redone. This is a road in the back of our farm. The front of our farm, the west side, is 8 feet higher in elevation, so we have tremendous flooding in the back. And that road used to be a muddy mess. So when trucks would come in to bring things for our compost operation, they would get stuck and were reluctant to come. So we were able to convince the utility company, as part of partnering with us on the solar energy station, that we needed the road remediated. And so they bought that, and they came in and dug out about 2 feet of muddy soil and put in gravel. And so now we have a usable road. We also have a rainwater retention pond that's about 40 feet in diameter, about 10 feet deep. And again, because the rear of our farm is 8 feet lower in elevation than the front, we have tremendous runoff and flooding in the back. What used to be lemons is now lemonade, because we're able to capture much of this water, and through a solar-powered pump, we pump it into these 2 2,400-gallon cisterns and use gravity to drip feed it back down through our fields. We also serve as a regional outreach training center for growing power. I think I mentioned Will Allen earlier. That's Will right there. That's actually a sister who was one of our founding members named Charity Hicks, who was killed a few years ago in New York. She was going to New York to speak out about the water crisis that exists in Detroit. She was standing on the sidewalk. A car jumped over the sidewalk, hit a light pole. The pole fell on her. She was in a coma for a month and died. And so she's become really an icon in Detroit for the justice struggle. So this was the USDA hoop house I talked about earlier. We built that as part of a workshop with Will Allen and his crew from Growing Power coming out and kind of leading the building of that. We sell our produce at farmers markets in the city of Detroit. We also sell at the farm on Saturdays and Sundays. We have typically 5 staff members at the farm. We're down to 3 right now. At this moment, we had some illnesses that occurred this year, and we rely heavily on volunteers. This is a broad fork, by the way, if you all aren't familiar with that. So that's once we use the machines to break up the ground for the first time, then after that we go to the manual, the labor, and use the broad fork to keep the soil kind of broken in subsequent years. We also have summer interns. Typically we have 5 or 6 each year that we employ that are with us for 12 weeks, and they both get training, and also they help us with what we're doing at the farm. And then we rely heavily on volunteers. This is one of our board members who also puts in some work. We love board members who actually do work. This was a Boy Scout group. This was a Boy Scout group who needed, one of the guys, this guy right here, was working on his Eagle Scout badge, and he needed to do a community service project, so he put in a growing area. And what we have to do at our farm, because we have tremendous pressure from groundhogs or woodchucks, and so we have to fence in everything. So you can see there's a gate that the young men had to build. They had to learn how to use saws to build that and pour concrete for the post. then they put the fencing around it. But on the ground back here, it's hard to see, but that's called hardware cloth. It's a type of wire mesh that we attach to the fence at the bottom, and we cover it with wood chips so that the groundhogs can't tunnel into our growing areas. So we have to put a tremendous amount of work into protecting our crops from animals. We're almost in a wilderness preserve area. This young lady also is a graduate of the school that I ran, and she's also currently employed in urban agriculture in the city of Detroit with another organization, but she's part of this movement. So this is if you want to contact us for more information. So I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up real quickly and just say that the food justice and food sovereignty movement has great potential. So although our organization is called the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, we call it that because in 2006 we weren't familiar with the term food sovereignty. But we know now that really what we're struggling for is food sovereignty, which is much more than just knowing that people have adequate amounts of culturally appropriate food. Really what we want is control of the food system that provides our food. And so that's what food sovereignty is, and that's really what we're working towards. So we think that the movement for food sovereignty and food justice has several ways that it can potentially improve society. One is food is a great uniter and a great common denominator. So regardless of what your religion is, regardless of what your so-called race is, regardless of what your gender or sexual orientation is, regardless of what your ideology or philosophy is, we all eat. And so this becomes a platform that we can unite people across differences. The food sovereignty movement causes us to think more critically about land use, both in urban areas and in rural areas, and about how we can create more equitable use of land. The food sovereignty movement has the potential for creating strong localized economies and kind of pushing back against this, the globalization that we see happening. Most of the farmers in the world are women, and let me say this. I like to publicly own my own stuff and say that I am a reforming chauvinist. And I say reforming because the women around me remind me that I'm still a work in progress. And I'll be working on this for the rest of my life. And I'm saying this because I want the men in the audience to hear this clearly, because patriarchy is like very damaging in the same way that I said white supremacy is damaging not only to black people and people of color, it's damaging to white people as well. The same with patriarchy. Not only does it suppress and damage women, but it suppresses and damages men, because we can't be our full self either. And so, and I'm telling you not something I read, but I'm telling you from my own personal journey. So I'm a male who is against patriarchy. I want you to know that clearly. And I would invite the other males in the audience to also, if you're not already on the journey, to become an anti-patriarchal male, to enter into that space and to contribute to equity. But the majority of the farmers in the world are women. And so the food sovereignty movement gives us the opportunity to also push back against patriarchy. The food sovereignty movement gives us the ability to be ecological stewards by employing regenerative practices. We know that the dominant agricultural system that we have in the United States is depleting topsoil at rates that far exceed our ability or the Earth's ability to create new topsoil. And so sustainable farming methods are creating new topsoil and preserving what we already have. The reality is that the current system of farming is not sustainable and will ruin the planet and will destroy our species if we don't turn things around quickly. And there's some people who think that maybe it's already too late. I would like to think that we still got a chance to save the earth. I hope. I don't know. I hope. And finally, it gives us the opportunity to practice a real people's democracy. So not all food justice and food sovereignty organizations are the same, but I can say for our organization, we are definitely trying to implement a form of democracy where all voices matter and where we're able to make decisions in a collective manner as opposed to these kind of hierarchical structures that we're usually, that we're used to working in. There's some barriers to this though, and we live in a world that has some very entrenched systems of oppression. One of those is the system of white supremacy that I mentioned, that in many ways grows out of colonialism and imperialism, where people from Western Europe went around the world and basically gangstered the rest of the planet from everybody else, right? They gangstered it at gunpoint. Give me what you got, you know? And this is mine now. And so even the prospect of land justice becomes more difficult, you know, when we think about the Western Hemisphere, because we're essentially on stolen land. And so it's a very difficult proposition to create justice on stolen land. So there's some real serious questions that we have to grapple with as we move forward. But the food justice movement is beginning to grapple with these questions. And again, I would invite you to have robust discussions. And a good starting point might be this book, as a matter of fact. I want to really recommend this. I don't even have it with me. I'm not trying to sell it. But this is a series of essays. It's edited by Eric Holt Gimenez, who's the executive director of Food First, and by Justine Williams. And it has several chapters, including a very robust section of the book on Black agroecology that I would invite you to read. But it's inviting us to think more critically about land and about how we can create land justice and land equity. So the problem that we have with land right now is that it's part of the way we're dealing with land is part of the capitalist system. And our organization is totally against capitalism. I want to be clear about that. If you're not clear about anything else I said today, please be clear that we are opposed to white supremacy, we're opposed to capitalism, we're opposed to patriarchy. But it's not just what we're opposed to. We're also in favor of some things. So I don't want to just leave it at that. But I want you to be very clear that capitalism, white supremacy has no safe quarter with us. We're like on a serious warrior tip, okay? But this idea that we have about land ownership is one of the pillars of capitalism, this idea that a human being can own part of the earth, right? And that you can accumulate, you can amass, you know, various sections of the earth, and then you can exclude other people from it, and you can charge people to be on it. This idea, which most of us accept uncritically, because the United States was created by people who came here from feudal societies, essentially, where very wealthy people enclosed the commons. And so people came over here with this idea that, yes, you can own part of the earth, and you can exclude people from it. And so this idea continues to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of typically wealthy white men, right? Wealthy white men. And I like those three terms because it hits on class, so-called race, and gender, three of the ways in which oppression manifests in this society. I think I'm out of time, so I think I'm going to wrap up by a couple things. One, I want to invite you to participate remotely in a class that I co-lead at the University of Michigan from January through April. It's called Food Literacy for All. And it's a 12-week class where we have primarily individual lecturers, and this year we're adding some panel discussions to it. And each session is videotaped. Actually, it's live streamed. So you can actually participate remotely if you want to, and you can have a discussion group that watches this remotely and then has a discussion afterwards, or you can watch the videotapes afterwards. They're on the University of Michigan Sustainable Food System Initiatives website. University of Michigan, let me give the sister a piece of paper. She's writing all over her hand. Oh, you're recording it too? Here, dear. So it's on the University of Michigan Sustainable Food System Initiatives website. The course starts in mid-January, I forgot the exact date, runs through April. We have some absolutely dope speakers, including Eric Holt Gimenez, who I just mentioned, LaDonna Redmond, Winona LaDuke, and many others. Oh, I got your attention with that, huh? So I want to invite you to participate remotely in that class. And then finally, I was so pleased at dinner last night when one of the students mentioned that she was reading Frantz Fanon in Abby's class. I was like, what? We got teachers teaching about Frantz Fanon here? You all know, how many people have heard of him or know? A few folks, okay. So I don't want to go into great detail. You can take Abby's class and get those details. But one of the things Frantz Fanon said that I like to end my talks with is each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its historical mission, fulfill it, or betray it. So this is our time. Let's get busy. Peace.
And we have some roving mics, is that right, Kim? So what we will do is I will recognize hands, and then the mic will come to you, and you'll get to ask a question, and
Malik
will answer, and we'll try to give first dibs to students, since that's our culture here in Dartmouth. But I'm just going to avoid the light shining in my eyes. So let's see, where are the mics? Oh, there they are. Okay, so hands, questions. I know some people have to leave, but we have some questions for students. Okay, you're student back there, right? Okay, let's start over there and then come back over here.
So, Mr. Yakini, I just had a question about a conflict of interest potentially. So your organization focuses on ensuring food security for your community, but I also hear a lot about food sovereignty and keeping farming sustainably. Do you ever find that these two pursuits conflict, and how do you deal with that?
Well, what I found is that there are many contradictions that we have to hold as we're moving towards the ideals that we hold and also function within the real world that we live in. So, for example, I think I stated pretty clearly that I'm against private ownership of land. I think it's ludicrous. But we're trying to buy the land that we farm on, right? Because within the context of the current society that we live in, that's the only way to really have some protection and security for the land. Another example is that U.S. currency is basically based on nothing. It's a con game in a sense. It used to be based on, metals that had real value. But even though I know that, I know the monetary system is a fraud, I've got some dollars in my pocket, right? And so there are many contradictions that I acknowledge and hold, and I think that that's just a necessity as we're moving, again, to this idealized state that we want to be at.
Yeah, I think the student had his next hand. Go ahead.
Hey, I met him this afternoon. What's up?
Hi.
You all right?
Hi again.
Hey.
Is this on? Hello. It's working. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on recent developments among young white gentrifying millennials that are like conducting similar activities by like growing plants in their homes and like growing vegetables in their homes. Is that something that's happening in Detroit with white populations there? And how do you make sense of them doing that?
I actually don't know what young white gentrifiers are doing in their homes because I haven't. I haven't actually been in their homes, but I know there's lots of them that are growing food on land in the city of Detroit. And so let me be clear. I'm not in favor of putting up a wall around the city of Detroit and say nobody new gets in. That would be ridiculous. In fact, I think there might be some value by new people coming in. But what I'm concerned about is that people who come in, one, do it with a sense of respect for the history in the neighborhoods that they're in, the history and the culture of the neighborhoods. They do it with an acknowledgement that there's existing leadership and that the community has existing aspirations, and they find how to come in with and fit into that rather than coming in and superimposing their ideas on what already exists. So I'm not for excluding, but I'm for justice.
Okay, another student over there. That hand just went up first, and then we'll take one over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi.
Hey.
I actually, a couple years back, got to visit DTown Farm.
For real?
Yeah.
Okay.
And while I was there, a gentleman that we spoke to alluded to, like, part of the water crisis issue with, like, privatization of the water and also the city indiscriminately shutting down water supplies. And so I was wondering to what extent you rely upon the rainwater and whether or not the indiscriminate shutdowns have been an issue on the farm.
So the water shutoffs haven't been an issue for our farm, but they certainly affect many of us as individuals. And I don't want to go into great detail about that because I don't want to incriminate myself in any way, but I'll just say that a number of people, so in Detroit, let me put it like this. In the city of Detroit, there are tens of thousands of people whose water has been shut off under the guise of trying to make the water department solvent. We think water is a human right, and that regardless of what your economic standing is, you have the right as a human being to have access to fresh water. So there are many people whose water has been shut off, and then there's usually what happens when the water department comes down a block and shuts it off. About a half an hour later, there's some brothers that roll up in a van, and they say, you know, we got water keys, we'll hook you up for $25. Some people are doing it for profit, which I'm opposed to. But if it's not done for profit, if it's done to restore people's water, I certainly am not opposed to that. I'm not going to encourage anyone to break the law, but I'm also not going to try to stop them from doing it. So it hasn't impacted the farm directly, but it has impacted some of us, and I'm kind of including myself in that, who work at the farm. But what has impacted us directly is that the water infrastructure in Detroit is very old. So even just last week, a water main broke and flooded the back of our farm. This is at least the second water main break in the last 2 months. About 2 months ago, another water main broke, and our water was off for about 3 weeks at the farm. And so that presented some serious challenges for us. So the antiquated infrastructure has impacted us more than the shutoffs because of people not paying their bills. We still, although the water retention system that we have provides a great deal of water, we still have to access the city water also. So it hasn't eliminated the use for city water, and there's some areas of the farm that we can't even use the water that we're collecting in the retention pond. So that kind of services the main growing area, but there's other areas that are so distant from that on the farm that we can't access that water. But thank you, it's good. Glad you've been to DTown Farm.
I had accidentally missed the hand. I've been up here for a while, so we'll give this student a chance. And then I know there's a hand back there, and then there was also some here in the middle. So go ahead.
Hey, thanks for your talk. I know that you mentioned kind of how you were able to bring like younger kids. You brought the Boy Scouts to the farm, and also adults. You know, there are a couple pictures there. Mm-hmm. I'm definitely very curious about whether or not you've had college-age students, like how you were able to bring them in, whether there are any challenges associated with like that particular age group, or whether they're actually like more receptive to it than others.
We probably have more college students that come to the farm than any other group. So we have lots and lots and lots of college students that come from colleges throughout the United States. Many colleges are doing alternative spring breaks now. So instead of going out to Fort Lauderdale and hanging out, they might come to Detroit for a week, and they might volunteer at our farm for a couple of days and volunteer a few other places in the city. We have lots of local college students who come out as groups. The University of Michigan first-year law students come out every year to our farm. So we have lots and lots, probably more college students than younger students. And for the most part, it works out well. If they can like stomach this, this kind of analysis we have of white supremacy, some people can't really take that. And so the people who feel uncomfortable with that, they don't usually work out too well. But the white people who come out to the farm and are trying to be white allies and can kind of own their own, participation in the white supremacy, it works out fine. That's, by the way, that's another reason that I publicly own being a reforming chauvinist, because I want the white people in the audience to feel comfortable owning your participation in white supremacy. So rather than me pointing the fingers and getting into the blame and shame game, I'm starting with myself and saying, I'm owning my stuff. I'm owning participating in patriarchy. I'm working really hard, and I've been working really hard for the last 30 years trying to get these antiquated ideas out of my head, and I'll be working on it the rest of my life, and I invite you to do the same with white supremacy. Simple, right? Hey, it's a black person. All the black people in the house, throw your hands up. All 5 of us.
Hi, Mr. Malik. Thank you so much for your talk, and it was a pleasure to come here tonight.
What's your name, since you know my name?
My name is Renee.
What up, Renee?
Smith.
You all right?
Nice to meet you. I am good.
Good.
Yes. So I study food policy at Vermont Law, just right outside of here.
All right.
And I just have a question. So through your experiences, how can legal practitioners support urban farms in these movements?
Good question. So all of our legal representation is done by the University of Michigan Law School's Community and Economic Development Clinic. And so they've been doing all of our legal work pro bono for several years. And I'll give you examples of what they've done. So I mentioned we have a license agreement with the city to operate on the land. They negotiated that agreement. We're currently renewing that agreement. In fact, we're changing it from a license agreement to a lease. There's a slight distinction. They're negotiating that. There's one guy named Nick Leonard, who actually is a graduate from University of Michigan Law School, who has become the go-to person in Detroit now for urban ag issues. And so a number of local growers go to him for issues related to purchasing land. One of the major issues now he's working on is related to water. So not only are local growers charged for their use of water, assuming they're not what we call jacking it from the fire hydrant, which some people do that. You get a key and you turn it on and you make it happen. But for those who are paying water bills, not only are they paying for water, but they're paying for sewerage. And for example, we have a water bill. We're tied into the city water main. In fact, we have 3 water bills because we have 3 different lines. And so the city is making the assumption that whatever comes through that meter, whatever is being used, then an equal amount is being put back in the stormwater management system. And so 75% of our water bill is for sewerage, which is ludicrous because we're on a permeable surface that's capturing water. We're diverting water from the stormwater system, even if we didn't have the retention pond. But with the retention pond, we're certainly diverting water, and so we shouldn't be charged for sewerage. And so that's one of the issues he's working on. So I'm speaking of specifically in Detroit, the kind of issues that local growers are faced with. And my guess would be in each municipality, the issues might change, depending on what the ordinances are there. But I would certainly encourage you, we need legal support in this struggle. And I would encourage you to continue to work with growers and other folks involved in the food movement. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much again for coming.
Thank you.
I worked this summer in Shanghai doing sustainability engagement with children, and you can imagine the urban environment. It was so difficult. I brought worms in for compost day, and it was a nightmare. Oh my God. It's like engaging children in things that are so foreign. It's like, what do you do? How have you, through 30 years worth of community engaging, what are some helpful hints with engaging in children or people who are more reluctant than others?
My experience has been that young children, my experience personally, I can't say this is the universal experience. Younger children are usually pretty open. It's the middle schoolers and up that, dealing with worms and planting seeds is not really that cool. But like 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, they're all the way in. We haven't had any reluctance with them. So, but with children always, I think I said I was a school principal for a number of years, so I have some experience dealing with children. And what I found is that children are very intuitive. As we get to be adults, we kind of ignore our intuition and, we buy what's coming out of people's mouths. Children, they don't care, but they go straight to the core, they read you. And so the first thing is to love the children you're working with. And if you love them, they feel that. And they tend to be open to whatever you're presenting with them if they feel a sense of love in a safe environment.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Okay, back there, sorry. Yeah, and then maybe people can just come up and talk to Malik after. Just worried that it's getting a little late. Go ahead.
Malik, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Over lunch today, you mentioned that the city of Detroit doesn't allow folks to raise chickens. And I was wondering what the frontier for animal proteins was at the farm. And in particular, as someone interested in fish, I was wondering if there were any initiatives focused on aquaponics or aquaculture. Can the fish be part of this program, or what's going on
First,
there?
I want to clarify what I said at lunch. I didn't say the city of Detroit won't allow people to raise chickens. What I said is raising chickens in Detroit is illegal. So I want to be clear that there's many people who are doing it. And there's many people who are consciously defying the law. There's also many people who are raising goats. So it's happening in spite of the government. And in fact, some people are consciously pushing the boundaries and pushing the envelope and pushing the government. So it is happening, but it's not legal. In some cases, if a neighbor calls, then the city will come out and enforce it. If a neighbor doesn't call, then it pretty much goes on. So I just want to make that slight distinction. We don't have aquaponics at our farm, although we've had a lot of conversation about it. And the main reason we don't have it is because we're totally off the grid, and the only electricity we have is that solar energy station. And we haven't yet been able to distribute that energy to different parts of the farm. That's about a $50,000 project to do trenching and lay cables. And so you have to have a controlled environment. You have to have electricity to do aquaponics. And so we're in favor of it. We have people who have suggested it and are ready to do it. We just don't have the infrastructure in place to make it happen. So we don't have any animal protein at DTown Farm, but there's plenty of other local growers that do.